Ayan had always believed that a quiet life was a safe life. At 22, he had learned how to keep most of his feelings to himself. He rarely argued with anyone, avoided unnecessary attention, and preferred spending his evenings with a book rather than at crowded gatherings. His future seemed simple. Finish his studies, find a good job, help his family, and build a life that made everyone proud. Love was not part of the plan, especially not the kind of love that could make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. One rainy evening, Ayan stopped at a small bookstore near his university. The rain had started suddenly, and he needed somewhere to wait until it became lighter. The bookstore was almost empty, filled with the quiet smell of old pages and coffee from the little cafe in the corner. Ayan walked toward the shelves and reached for a notebook. At exactly the same moment, another hand reached for it. "Sorry," a young man said. Ayan looked up. The stranger had dark hair, a warm smile, and an expression that suggested he found the situation amusing rather than embarrassing. "You take it," Ayan said. "No, you reached it first. You were here first." The stranger smiled. "Then we'll have to decide this scientifically." Ayan raised an eyebrow. "Scientifically? Rock, paper, scissors." Ayan almost laughed. "Over a notebook?" Important decisions require serious methods. For the first time that day, Ayan smiled. They played. Ayan lost. The stranger picked up the notebook triumphantly. "I told you science works." Ayan shook his head. "That's not science." "It worked, didn't it?" Before Ayan could answer, the young man held out the notebook. "Actually, you can have it. I don't need it." Ayan accepted it. "Thanks." "I'm Zain." "Ayan." "Nice to meet you, Ayan." There was something strangely easy about the conversation. Zain didn't seem interested in impressing him or asking personal questions. He simply talked as though they had known each other longer than 5 minutes. They ended up sitting in the cafe while the rain continued outside. Zain ordered tea. Ayan ordered coffee. Their conversation moved from books to university, then to music and future dreams. "I want to travel," Zain said. "Not just for photographs. I want to see places where nobody knows me." Ayan looked at him curiously. "Why does nobody knowing you matter?" Zain paused. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "people decide who you are before you get the chance to decide for yourself." The word stayed with Ayan. He understood more than he wanted to admit. By the time the rain stopped, nearly 2 hours had passed. Ayan glanced at his phone and stood. "I should go." Zain nodded. "Sure." Ayan walked toward the door, then heard Zain call his name. "Hey, Ayan." He turned. "You forgot your notebook." Ayan looked down. The notebook was already in his hand. Zain laughed. "I was testing you." Ayan smiled despite himself. "You're strange." "Maybe." Ayan left the bookstore that evening without knowing that the conversation would stay in his mind. The next day, he returned to the same bookstore. He told himself he needed another notebook. He knew that wasn't true. Zain wasn't there. Ayan felt strangely disappointed and immediately became annoyed with himself for feeling that way. A week later, they met again by chance. Then again. Soon, their meetings stopped feeling accidental. Sometimes they talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes they stayed for hours. Zain made Ayan laugh more than anyone had in years, while Ayan became the person Zain trusted with thoughts he rarely shared. Their friendship grew quietly. Ayan never questioned it. Not first. Then one evening, Zain didn't show up. Ayan waited longer than usual. He checked his phone several times, pretending he wasn't waiting for a message. Nothing. On his way home, Ayan finally understood something that made him uncomfortable. He missed Zain. Not simply as a friend. He missed his voice, his jokes, his questions, and the way an ordinary evening seemed different whenever Zain was there. A message finally appeared on his phone. "Zain, sorry I couldn't come today. Hope your evening wasn't boring without me." Ayan stared at the screen. Then he smiled. He typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, and finally sent. Ayan, it was definitely quieter. He put his phone away and continued walking through the evening rain. For the first time, Ayan wondered whether Zain was becoming something more than a friend. He wasn't ready to name the feeling, but somewhere inside him, a new chapter had already begun. By the beginning of the next semester, Ayan and Zain had become inseparable friends. They studied together, shared jokes between classes, and often returned to the bookstore where they had first met. Their friendship felt natural, but Ayan had started noticing small changes in himself. He checked his phone more often when he knew Zain might message. He remembered tiny details about Zain that nobody else seemed to notice. And whenever Zain walked into a room, Ayan's attention somehow found him before he even realized it. Ayan told himself it was friendship. It had to be. One afternoon, they sat outside the university library. Zain was working on an assignment while Ayan read through his notes. "You're staring at the same page," Zain said. Ayan looked up. "I'm reading." "You've been reading that page for 10 minutes. "I'm thinking." "About the page?" Ayan closed the book. "You're annoying." Zain laughed. Moments like that made Ayan feel comfortable. Around Zain, he didn't have to pretend to be serious all the time. He could laugh, complain, and talk about things he normally kept hidden. One evening, Zain asked Ayan to meet him on a quiet rooftop overlooking the city. The sunset had already disappeared, leaving the sky dark and calm. Below them, lights filled the streets. Zain leaned against the wall. "Do you ever feel like people expect you to become someone you're not?" Ayan looked at him. "All the time. My family has plans for me," Zain continued. "My friends have opinions about what my life should look like. Sometimes I wonder whether anyone actually knows what I want." "What do you want?" Zain smiled faintly. "That's the problem. I'm still figuring it out." Ayan nodded. "Maybe everyone is." Zain looked at him for a moment. "You always make things sound simple." "They aren't simple." "No," Zain said, "but you make me feel like they might be." Ayan didn't know how to respond. The silence between them felt different from their usual comfortable silence. Zain finally looked away. "I'm scared of being judged," he said. Ayan's expression softened. "Then don't let people decide your worth." Zain gave a quiet laugh. "You say that like you don't care what people think." Ayan looked toward the city. "I care too much." "Exactly." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Zain asked, "Have you ever liked someone who wasn't who you expected to like?" Ayan's heart seemed to beat faster. He tried to keep his voice steady. "What do you mean?" "Nothing specific." But there was something in Zain's expression that made Ayan wonder whether the question was really nothing. Ayan looked away. "I don't know." Zain nodded. "You don't have to know." The words should have made Ayan feel relieved. Instead, they stayed in his mind long after they left the rooftop. Over the next few weeks, Ayan became increasingly confused. He wasn't unhappy. In fact, he was happier than he had been in a long time. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Zain had become the first person he wanted to tell whenever something happened. Good news. Bad news. A stupid joke. A difficult day. Everything seemed to lead back to Zain. One afternoon, they sat in their usual cafe. Zain was unusually quiet. "What's wrong?" Ayan asked. "Nothing." "I know you better than that." Zain smiled sadly. "Maybe that's a problem." Ayan frowned. "What does that mean?" Zain looked directly at him. "It means you're important to me." Ayan couldn't answer. Zain continued carefully. "Sometimes I wonder whether you feel the same way." Ayan's thoughts froze. He knew exactly what Zain was asking, even though the words hadn't been spoken directly. Fear immediately filled the space where an answer should have been. Ayan looked down at his coffee. "I don't know." Zain nodded slowly. "That's okay." He didn't pressure him. That somehow made Ayan feel worse. On the way home, Ayan replayed the conversation again and again. He realized he wasn't afraid because he felt nothing. He was afraid because he felt something he had never expected. That night, Ayan stood by his bedroom window, watching the city lights. He finally allowed himself to say the truth quietly. "Maybe I love him." The words frightened him, but they also felt honest. Zain was no longer simply the friend he met in a bookstore. He had become someone Ayan couldn't imagine losing. And for the first time, Ayan understood that some feelings don't arrive with permission. They simply appear and wait for you to decide what to do with them. For the next few days, Ayan avoided Zain. He told himself he needed time to understand his feelings, but deep down he knew he was running away from them. Zain noticed immediately. Their usual messages became shorter. Their conversations at the cafe disappeared. Even when they passed each other at university, Ayan found an excuse to look somewhere else. At first, Zain gave him space. Then one evening, Ayan received a message. "Zain, did I do something wrong?" Ayan stared at the screen for several minutes. He wanted to say no. He wanted to explain everything. Instead, he typed, "Ayan, no, I'm just busy." He knew it was a weak excuse. Zain didn't reply. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument could have been. Ayan tried to return to his normal routine. He studied, attended classes, and spent time with his family. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Inside, everything had changed. The bookstore reminded him of Zain. The cafe reminded him of Zain. Even certain songs made him remember conversations they had shared. Ayan finally understood that avoiding Zain wasn't making his feelings disappear. It was only making him lonely. One afternoon, Ayan saw Zain leaving the university. "Zain!" Zain stopped. For a moment, neither moved. Ayan walked toward him. "Can we talk?" Zain looked uncertain, but nodded. They sat on a bench beneath a large tree. "You've been avoiding me," Zain said. "I know." "Why?" Ayan looked at the ground. "Because I'm scared." Zain was quiet. "Of me?" "No." Ayan took a breath. "Of what this means." Zain understood. He didn't ask Ayan to explain further. Ayan continued. "I've spent my whole life trying to be the person everyone expects me to be. I've always thought I knew what my future would look like. And now I don't know." Zain looked at him calmly. "You don't have to know everything today." Ayan looked up. "That's easy for you to say." "No, it isn't." Zain's voice became quieter. "I'm scared too." That surprised Ayan. "I thought you were sure." "I was never sure. I just knew that pretending not to care about you would hurt more." Ayan felt tears gathering in his eyes, but quickly looked away. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't lose me because you're confused. What if things change?" "They already have." Ayan looked at him. Zain smiled faintly. "We can't go back to the day we met. But that doesn't mean what comes next has to be bad." For the first time in weeks, Ayan felt able to breathe. They sat together without speaking. Eventually, Ayan said, "I think I've been trying to find the perfect answer. Maybe there isn't one. What if I make the wrong choice?" Zain shrugged gently. "Then we learn from it." Ayan smiled. That was the thing he appreciated most about Zain. Zain never made promises about a perfect future. He simply offered honesty. Ayan realized that love wasn't always about knowing exactly where a relationship would end. Sometimes it was about being brave enough to take the next step. They walked toward the bookstore together. The evening was cool, and the streets were beginning to fill with lights. Inside the bookstore, Ayan found a notebook from the day they first met. He picked it up and laughed. "Still can't believe this started because of a notebook." Zain smiled. "You lost rock, paper, scissors. I let you win." "Of course." They both laughed. Then the laughter faded into a comfortable silence. Ayan looked at Zain. "I don't know what happens next." Zain nodded. "Neither do I. But I don't want to keep pretending you don't matter to me." Zain's expression softened. "You matter to me too." Ayan reached for Zain's hand. It was a simple gesture, but for Ayan it represented a decision. He wasn't choosing certainty. He wasn't choosing a perfect future. He was choosing honesty. For the first time, he stopped asking whether his feelings were acceptable to everyone else. He asked himself whether they were honest. And they were. Outside, the city continued moving as it always had. But for Ayan, something had changed. He had spent weeks believing that love was a problem he needed to solve. Now he understood that it was a feeling he needed to face. He didn't know where his relationship with Zain would lead. But he finally knew one thing. He didn't want fear to decide for him anymore. Several months passed. After the evening, Ayan finally stopped running from his feelings. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still difficult days, uncomfortable conversations, and moments when Ayan wondered whether he had made everything more complicated than it needed to be. But there was one important difference. He was no longer pretending. Ayan and Zain continued building their relationship slowly. They studied together, supported each other's goals, and learned how to talk honestly whenever something bothered them. Sometimes they disagreed. Zain wanted Ayan to take more chances with his future. Ayan preferred planning everything carefully. "You think too much," Zain would say. "And you don't think enough," Ayan would answer. Then they would laugh. Their differences didn't disappear, but they learned that love wasn't about finding someone exactly like yourself. It was about understanding someone different and respecting who they were. Ayan also began changing in other parts of his life. He became more confident at university. He started speaking up when he had an opinion instead of automatically agreeing with everyone around him. His family noticed. One evening, his mother asked, "You've seemed happier lately. Is something good happening?" Ayan smiled. "Maybe I'm finally figuring out who I want to be." She looked at him for a moment, but didn't push him for an explanation. That small moment gave Ayan courage. He realized that honesty didn't always have to arrive as one dramatic conversation. Sometimes it could happen gradually, through patience and trust. Zain was experiencing his own changes. He had once worried constantly about being judged. Now he was beginning to believe that other people's opinions didn't have to control his entire life. One evening, they met at the same bookstore where everything had begun. Zain walked toward the shelves and picked up a notebook. "Should we recreate our first meeting?" Ayan laughed. "Absolutely not. I already know you'll cheat. I won fair and square." "You still say that?" "Because it's true." They walked through the bookstore together, remembering their first conversation. Ayan stopped near the cafe. "I used to think that day was just a random accident." "Maybe it was. But it changed everything." Zain looked at him. "Do you regret it?" Ayan shook his head. "Never." They sat near the window. Outside, the evening rain began falling. Ayan watched the drops slide down the glass. "I was so afraid," he said. "Of what?" "Of losing the life I thought I was supposed to have." Zain listened. "And now?" Ayan smiled. "Now I understand that my life is mine to live." Zain reached across the table and gently held his hand. Neither needed to say anything. Their relationship had never been about proving anything to the world. It was about two people choosing honesty, kindness, and patience with each other. Ayan knew there would still be challenges. Some people might not understand. Some conversations might be difficult. The future might not always be predictable. But uncertainty no longer frightened him as much as it once had. He had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. Sometimes courage was simply refusing to let fear make every decision. The rain stopped. They left the bookstore and walked along the quiet street. Ayan looked at the building behind them. "Do you remember what you said when we first met?" Zain thought for a moment. "Something about science?" Ayan laughed. "You said important decisions require serious methods. And I was right." Ayan shook his head. "Maybe." They continued walking. After a few moments, Ayan stopped. "You know, there's something I never told you." Zain turned. "What?" Ayan smiled. "When I first met you, I thought you were just a strange guy who wanted to win a notebook." Zain laughed. "And now?" Ayan looked at him warmly. "Now you're the person I never expected to love." Zain's smile softened. "And you're the person I never expected to meet." They continued walking beneath the evening sky. Ayan no longer knew exactly what the future would bring, but he didn't need to. For years, he had believed that a meaningful life required a perfect plan. Now he understood something much simpler. Sometimes the most important chapters begin unexpectedly. Sometimes the person who changes your life arrives when you're least prepared. And sometimes love isn't about finding the person you imagined. It's about recognizing the person who quietly becomes important to you and having the courage to choose honesty when that realization finally arrives. Ayan looked at Zain beside him and smiled. The boy he had never expected to love had become part of the story he never knew he needed. And for the first time, Ayan was excited to see what the next chapter would bring.